This is what's happening in Colombia. You probably don't know. Here's what's happening. So Colombia's anti-government protests continued into their third week after union members, students, pensioners, and workers demonstrated. And look what sparked it. Riot police fired tear gas and stun bombs at protesters gathered in the capital's central Boulevard Plaza, while protesters threw rocks and shattered glass benches. The demonstrations began in late April, initially fueled by outrage over a now canceled tax plan. Sound familiar? That's kind of what happened in France, which sparked the Gilets jaunes. So there they are. So Colombian protesters were not scared anymore. Anti-government protests in Colombia are entering the third week. The demonstrations were sparked by a government proposal to increase taxes as millions of people have seen their homes shrink due to COVID. But they have continued for days, even after the government withdrew its proposed tax plan. Protest leaders say their demands now go much further and include calls for basic income, free tuition at public universities, and a reform of the police. Wow, that sounds familiar, although reform is too little too late for our police. And good to know we're not the only country whose government completely abandoned its own people during the COVID pandemic. So that's nice to hear. And in case you were wondering, they don't need to protest for universal health care there. They already have it. The rallies were organized by Colombia's biggest trade unions, but were also joined by many middle-class people who feared the changes could see them slip into poverty. Tens of thousands of people marched in the capital, Bogota, but there were also demonstrations in other major cities and smaller towns. And by the way, yes, strong unions are kind of important. We could really use strong unions in this country again. One of the issues which has most angered protesters is the actions of riot police. On May 4th, the United Nations Human Rights Office accused Colombia's security forces of using excessive force and alarmed by reports that police had opened fire on protesters. The protesters want the riot police to be disbanded and for all members of the security forces to be held accountable by an independent body rather than by military courts. Wow. So they get into the streets after one instance of police brutality. They got in the streets. Many of the protesters' demands are rooted in Colombia's high level of inequality. The coronavirus pandemic has made the lives of many Colombians more precarious, with unemployment spreading and 3.6 million Colombians being pushed into poverty. So Max, what it's interesting to see neoliberalism is getting kicked in the balls everywhere. What would you like to add to that?
Well, it's not just, it is neoliberalism, and it is the lockdown policy that I described, where people are barricaded in their homes and businesses are shut down and no one gets any aid or support. But it's also Colombia's particular role in South America is being challenged here in a way it hasn't in a long time. And this right-wing administration, which has essentially been installed by kind of narco regime and is backed fully by the U.S. This is about Colombia's role, in the words of Hugo Chavez, as the Israel of South America. It plays very much the same role in the region that Israel plays in the Middle East, as a U.S. bulwark, platform for attacking other left-wing movements and governments in the region. You can constantly see U.S. troops doing drills on the Colombian-Venezuelan border. There was the phony aid invasion of Venezuela in February 2019. That Ivan Duque, the president, was on the border there with all the U.S. officials and Juan Guaido. And so this government is being challenged in a way it hasn't before. This government is the product of U.S. infiltration and is deeply connected to the U.S. president personally, Joe Biden. Joe Biden, and I wrote about this at the Gray Zone, he bragged on the campaign trail about his role in shepherding Plan Colombia through the Senate. And Plan Colombia was originally kind of understood as kind of a peace plan a plan to make peace between the FARC, the left-wing militia, and the right-wing militias and the government. And under Biden's stewardship in the Senate, the plan became basically a war plan where $4 out of $5 that were sent by the U.S. in this unprecedented aid package to Colombia went to the Colombian military and police forces. And basically the goal was to exterminate the FARC, kill its leadership, and then force them to the negotiating table in very weakened condition. So in 2006, a huge scandal erupted in Colombia called the false positive scandal, where it was revealed that the Colombian military, in their need to get more military aid from the U.S. by basically making up numbers of FARC guerrillas exterminated, lured a bunch of poor rural laborers to a site some 20 miles away from where they were from, then shot them all, just killed them in cold blood. Scores of poor laborers, dressed them up in FARC uniforms, took pictures, and claimed that they killed all these guerrillas, sent it back to the U.S. It turns out actually that hundreds of massacres like this have been committed, that something like 6,000 people were killed in this way. And this was all done under the watch of Alvaro Uribe, who is the mentor of the current Colombian president, Iván Duque. And it was something that Joe Biden was so proud of. This is the legacy of Plan Colombia, that he boasted about it in his presidential campaign in 2020. So it's deeply connected to this administration, that they installed this right-wing regime to break regional unity in South America, to shatter the hope of socialism. And they're starting to finally feel popular pushback. Iván Duque came to power after this historic peace agreement between FARC and the government and the right-wing militias. And immediately he started breaking the agreements. You would start to see social leaders, lawyers, rural campesino leadership being killed, but also FARC former guerrillas who had given up their arms under the historic peace agreement under Juan dos Santos, his predecessor, were also being targeted. And you know who was targeting them in some cases, especially the higher level figures? It was the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency of the U.S. They would basically use their snitch network inside Colombia to start accusing all of these FARC figures of drug trafficking, and they would have to go into hiding, and they started giving up on the peace treaty. The Colombian public really wants peace, and they see Duque and the U.S. behind him breaking this agreement, shattering peace, bringing the country back into instability. Duque himself came to power thanks to tens of thousands of dollars in vote buying from a drug trafficker named Nene Hernandez, who got a better seat at Duque's inauguration than the Chief Justice of Colombia's Supreme Court. This all came out in wiretaps after Hernandez was killed, I believe. And so you have this corrupt right-wing government, and it's going out in the streets with these protesters who started out protesting austerity. It was going to be a tax hike to pay for healthcare that no one's getting, and then no one knows where the money's going because the money just keeps disappearing. And now it's about Duque himself. It's about Alvaro Uribe. It's about this Uribista, right-wing, U.S.-backed narco regime. And that's why people aren't leaving the streets, because they actually want regime change, but it's a regime change that the U.S. is dead set against. The U.S. cannot tolerate even like a center-left figure coming in, because part of this is about overthrowing the government of Venezuela. It's about propping up this whole system they've created in South America. And if you look at the footage from the protests that viral footage on social media, you'll see a lot of these bike cops who are being funded. This is a notorious division of the police, being funded through Plan Colombia, which Biden bragged about, working hand in glove with ununiformed paramilitary, shooting protesters. So far, 50 people have been killed in the protests. And, if this is happening in Venezuela, it was happening in Hong Kong, where the police killed no one, to my knowledge, none of the protesters. it would be on the front page of every paper, but it only registered for like 3 days in the mainstream press here, and we know why.
So people don't know that the goal, the United States cannot allow a successful socialist government in South America or Central America, and if they get one, they immediately have to overthrow it, and which is why we have this what we did to Cuba. So you can't have governments giving people health care and education and providing for them. It would make us look bad. So they go and overthrow, because it would make capitalism look bad. And so that's really what the whole deal has been ever since Smedley Butler to the whole deal. They're doing this at the behest of United States corporations, and it was the cat got let out of the bag on Fox News when Bolton, when he was working for Trump, admitted that the reason why we got to go in there is for American corporations and our oil companies, and so that's what's going on in Colombia. I haven't been have you noticed that it's gotten much press?
There were like 3 days, and Shakira, the Colombian pop star, was she said something stupid about it, took a picture of herself like looking glamorous, and got a lot of pushback. So she made a more strongly worded statement in that kind of 3-day period, and you saw kind of pressure on celebrities and public figures to say something about the mowing down of protesters and Duque's corrupt regime. And then it's sort of gone away, but the protests have continued. And, I think we're in the midst of a kind of regional shift where Chile looks to be able to pass a new constitution that will replace the Pinochet-era constitution, because 2/3 of its parliament will be left-wing. Peru could have a left-wing president, which is, unprecedented after the counterinsurgency campaign that it witnessed against the Shining Path. This would be unbelievable. And it's happening across the whole region. So the U.S. is trying to hold on to this bulwark. And the figure who's sort of waiting in the wings is not necessarily a left-wing socialist. He does have roots in the socialist movement, but he's considered very moderate. Gustavo Petro, who is the former mayor of Bogota. And he's even distanced himself from the protests. He hasn't appeared in them. But for the U.S., this would be a terrible result. It would mean he would adopt a softer line towards Venezuela, and he would not tolerate the way that the DEA has basically controlled government after government to prop up this narco regime to serve their own ends. And the Biden administration is even rejecting a push from Gregory Meeks, the House Foreign Affairs Committee chair, who I mentioned earlier, to open up dialogue with Venezuela. Venezuela has just appointed 2 opposition members to its Central Electoral Council, and is making all of these gestures. It's let out 6 corrupt Venezuelan American businessmen who looted Citgo. It's let them free under U.S. pressure. It's doing everything it can to open a dialogue with the U.S., and the Biden administration is turning its back, continuing to recognize this fraud, Juan Guaido. And it appears that regime change is still paramount. It appears that Tony Blinken is basically Mike Pompeo with a lower body mass index. Mm-hmm. I see complete continuity here, even under pressure from Democratic leadership in the Congress. And that means that Colombia's right-wing regime must stay.
Hey, everybody, this is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.